Hello everybody, welcome to this video on sustainable plane travel in the age of the Green Deal. I am Mel Bouvier, a student in the Master in International Security at the Paris School of International Affairs, and I am doing this presentation today for the course The EU Green Deal Sustainability Policies in an International Perspective. Here is the outline for the presentation, with first some elements of context to help you grasp this topic, then some key facts followed by some key relevant concepts. I will then delve into the policy framework and the international dimension of this issue. When presented in December 2019, the European Green Deal was announced as a move towards a significant systemic change, a transition to more sustainable lifestyles and habits across the Union, leading the way to a global transformation of society as a whole. However, such a fundamental change, necessary to preserve an increasingly precarious environment, is arguably difficult to realize in such a short period of time, bearing in mind the perspective of 2030 and 2050 in the Green Deal. Some sectors like aviation are extremely rigid, with few green alternatives that are usually very costly, inefficient, or time-consuming, disincentivizing their use. In this video, we will be focusing on the topic of plane travel. Travel has increasingly evolved as a leisure activity over the past 2 decades, becoming more accessible, notably through cheaper plane tickets and the multiplication of low-cost options. While traveling by plane is still reserved for a few privileged individuals on a global scale, it has still considerably extended to more modest fractions of society, and the volume of passengers is growing exponentially. According to the European Commission, greenhouse gas emissions caused by aviation in the EU have increased by nearly 27% in only 6 years, between 2013 and 2019. So the big question we're addressing here is how, while traveling has become a leisure activity for EU citizens, do we adapt plane travel in the face of an ecological crisis to make it fit within the legal frame of the European Green Deal? Technological advances that would enable low-emission plane travel are still at this stage of research and development and will not be mature or put on the market soon enough to meet the EU's objectives. However, it is also inconceivable now, given the importance of aviation and our strong dependence on it, to completely stop air travel by 2050. With aviation having such a big part in the life of Europeans, whether they are traveling for leisure or for work, and in the economy of some dependent countries, it seems a systemic, global change of habits is necessary, combined with the development of greener technologies in plane travel. Now, here are a few facts that might help you get a better understanding of the problem. First of all, let's talk numbers and more specifically emissions. The transport sector represents approximately 25% of the total emissions in the EU that have been increasing the most, and the aviation sector accounts for 14.4%. Scaling up to the broader picture, aviation accounts for 2% of global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. However, greenhouse gas emissions are not the only environmental problem caused by planes. Aircrafts create condensation trails or contrails that trigger the formation of cirrus clouds, adding to global warming, as well as ozone, methane, and aerosols, etc. Despite those consequences, the volume of tourists who travel by plane keeps reaching new records. If the pandemic pinned the planes down for a few months, those numbers are now going back up and are almost reaching their 2019 levels. The summer of 2022 has been called by many media the summer of revenge tourism, where, tired of the restrictions and lockdown, tourists rushed to travel abroad, especially to European destinations. EU targets and ambitions for 2030 have been set in the Fit for 55 package in July 2021 and aim at reducing GHG by 55%. A first step towards carbon neutrality in 2050. Aviation is one of the topics of interest in the Fit for 55 package, which gives great importance to the transportation sector, and I will delve into it later. While there are hopes for technological advances in the long term, like the hydrogen aircraft or the electric aircraft, the development of such technologies is not going fast enough to be implanted on the market to meet the targets of the EU GD in the next 2 decades. Besides, it is quite hard to replace the entire fleet of aircrafts in such a short period of time. The average lifespan of an aircraft is 20 to 30 years. Therefore, the solution to make planes more eco-friendly while we wait for the electric or hydrogen aircrafts might be sustainable aviation fuels, considered to have the most potential to reduce emissions in the short term. The EU considers 2 main types of SAF in its Refuel EU initiative: biofuel, made from residue or waste from feedstock crops, and synthetic kerosene, made from green hydrogen. Here are some maps that illustrate the importance of air travel in Europe. On the left, you can see the busiest routes inside the EU, and note that they are mostly used for trips that could be done by train, for example. On the right, I created a map of the biggest airports in Europe by number of passengers in 2019. The first one is Heathrow, followed by Charles de Gaulle, then Amsterdam, then Frankfurt, and then Madrid. All of those airports have more than 50 million passengers in the year 2019. I am now going to delve into two important concepts when it comes to transforming plane travel, both in the mobility system and in the leisure system. As I said before, the European Green Deal is intended as a systemic change. The first one is eco-efficiency, which refers to a sort of win-win situation where we produce more, increase productivity and the economic output, while decreasing the negative impacts of the economic activity on the environment. Applied to aviation, eco-efficiency would refer to the application of innovations in the aviation sector, like the electric plane that would reduce emissions and other negative externalities of plane travel without hindering it. We could say that eco-efficiency is production-based. The second one is eco-sufficiency. This concept can be linked to the idea of enoughness, that is to say, living well with less. Eco-sufficiency is consumption-based. It refers to an idea of responsible behavior for consumers that are voluntarily limiting their consumption and consequently the pressure put on resources. For example, in our case study, one could limit the number of flights they board each year or reserve air travel exclusively for long-distance overseas travel. A counterexample could be mass tourism, referring to the large number of tourists who flock to popular destinations for leisure. Europe is one of those destinations, with France being the most visited country in the world. Through mass tourism, we witness a commodification of travel and popular monuments or places treated as consumer goods. Considering the deeply entrenched consumerism ideal that has been shaping the lives of Western citizens and increasingly the entire world for the past centuries, such a shift towards a slower and more eco-sufficient mindset might be difficult to execute. The ability to travel by plane quite cheaply has been acquired relatively recently for most citizens, who do not seem like they want to give up this opportunity, especially with the example of revenge tourism that we saw earlier. Now that we went through the key facts and concepts necessary to understand this topic, what are the policies in place in the European Green Deal to address the issues with civil aviation, and do they touch upon eco-efficiency and eco-sufficiency? The main framework that addresses aviation emissions is the new Fit for 55 package. It introduces several new measures. First of all, phasing out free emissions allowances in the emission trading system, ETS. Free allowances give a right to a certain volume of emissions each year for each sector or company. The ETS also encourages the use of biofuel by attributing them zero emissions under RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive. The second measure would be Refuel EU Aviation. This initiative has not been adopted yet, but it aims at promoting the use of sustainable aviation fuels like second-generation biofuels that use residues and waste instead of actual feedstock, and e-fuels like synthetic kerosene. It is supply-oriented, putting obligations on fuel suppliers instead of users. It also works against tankering practices, that is to say, the practice of overfilling fuel tanks in airports where kerosene is cheaper or subject to less taxes. The next measure would be implementing the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA, which was created by the International Civil Aviation Organization for flights departing or arriving to countries that are outside the EU ETS. CORSIA allows the aircraft operators to use SAF instead of having to purchase emission offsets. Finally, it would be interesting to increase funding for innovation and modernization of aircrafts to promote the development of greener technologies. The new proposal from the EU aims to reduce aviation CO2 emissions by 5% by 2030 and 60% by 2050, and requires airlines at EU airports to use at least 5% of sustainable aviation fuels in 2030 and 63% by 2050. Those sustainable aviation fuels are not a perfect option, however. Biofuels, even second-generation ones, often imply a trade-off between fuel production and other uses. Synthetic kerosene is produced from hydrogen and thus also induces trade-offs with other energy sectors. SAF is also significantly more expensive than fuel produced from fossil energy. Moving on to the international dimension. Some countries and regions are heavily dependent on air travel for tourism, for example, but also for commerce, freight, or supply. Think of islands, for example, or countries whose economy rely on tourism. Increased prices for aviation or aviation fuel would be highly detrimental to such regions, creating unfair competition. Such specific cases should be considered and taken into account. Another international complexity concerns the risk of carbon leakage and the tinkering practices. Such issues could be solved through a carbon border adjustment mechanism similar to the one already in place in some industries to prevent international market distortions. Other types of policies could be crafted. The EU could potentially work towards incentivizing the use of more sustainable transportation within the Union, that is exceptionally well connected with trains, in contrast with the US, for example. Generally, the distances within the Union are relatively short, and it is often faster to travel by train than plane between big cities. The use of greener alternatives to planes like trains needs to be incentivized for shorter distances and domestic travel within, reserving the use of air travel for more distant destinations or when there is no other viable choice. To conclude, the EU has taken huge steps to achieve their target emissions reduction, especially through the Fit for 55 package with the transportation sector. It has mostly focused on improving eco-efficiency, preserving the aviation sector while capitalizing on innovations like SAF to make it more sustainable. Air travel is a tricky sector because of its specificities. There are no substantial alternatives to air travel that can meet today's expectations of distance and time efficiency. A sector like tourism is heavily dependent on it, and sometimes it represents a key aspect of the economy for some countries. I believe that, for the Green Deal to be effective and truly trigger a systemic change, eco-efficiency has to be coupled with eco-sufficiency. Plane travel is deeply entrenched in traveling habits. It appears quite complex to significantly reduce plane travel by 2050, let alone to completely phase it out. Yet, paradoxically enough, citizens have also expressed their concerns over reducing their own emissions to preserve good air quality and prevent noise pollution, and some have even sworn to stop traveling by plane, opting for greener alternatives, showing an emerging transformation in citizens' mindsets. Eco-efficiency needs to be applied in an egalitarian way, avoiding a situation where the less privileged parts of the population have to take the hit and suffer the greatest impacts on their habits, while the most privileged maintain their lifestyle. This situation also echoes the controversy over the use of private jets for short trips by millionaires this summer. If you would like to learn more about these topics, here are some additional resources you could use. And finally, here are the resources used for the information and data in this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you liked this video.